Chapter 1. The Hope's Reach glided silently through the inky void of space, a beacon of peace amidst the chaos of the galaxy. The ship's sleek design shimmered under the light of distant stars, its purpose noble and simple: to heal. Captain Elias Dorsey stood at the command deck, his gaze fixed on the monitor in front of him. The soft hum of the ship's engines was the only sound that filled the room, a reminder of the vessel's tranquil mission. But Elias knew that peace in space was often fleeting, like a star whose light was on the brink of dying out. "Captain," came a voice from behind him, breaking the silence. Lieutenant Sarah Mendez, his first officer, stood at attention. "We've just received an encrypted message from the Zorvak system." Elias glanced over his shoulder. His brow furrowed at the mention of the Zorvak, a fierce and unpredictable species, infamous for their ruthless military tactics and expansionist ambitions. They were a force humanity had managed to avoid, but their reputation was ever present in the back of his mind. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice calm, betraying none of his inner unease. Mendez hesitated, her fingers hovering over the console. She glanced at Elias, her expression unreadable. "It's a direct threat, Captain. They're coming. They demand we abandon our mission or face consequences." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Elias didn't need to ask what those consequences would be. The Zorvak didn't make idle threats. They were conquerors, not negotiators. But Hope's Reach wasn't a warship, it was a medical vessel. Its mission was clear: to offer aid, not to fight. Elias turned back to the view outside the ship. His hands clenched behind his back. The peaceful nature of the mission was what made the Hope's Reach so significant. They weren't part of the ongoing galactic wars. They didn't take sides. Humanity had earned a reputation for spreading healing, not destruction. But in a galaxy full of predators, that reputation made them a target. "Do you believe them?" Elias asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Mendez's eyes darted to the display. "There's no reason to doubt them, Captain. Their fleet is massive. They're out for something, whether it's our resources, our medical tech, or just to send a message." Elias exhaled sharply. The weight of the decision settled on him. Prepare the ship. Increase security protocols. Let's hope they're bluffing. He knew it was a long shot. The Zorvak never bluffed. Their culture was built on dominance and power, and they would never understand the concept of a peaceful mission. To them, the Hope's Reach was weak, and weakness in their eyes was something to be eradicated. As Elias walked to his command seat, his mind raced. The threat was not just against the ship, it was an attack on everything he stood for. His role as captain was not just about protecting the crew, but also ensuring that the mission of healing continued, no matter the cost. But now, that mission was in jeopardy. Minutes later, a sudden alarm blared, the sound slicing through the quiet of the command deck. A red light flashed on the central console, signaling an incoming hostile fleet. Elias shot to his feet. "They've found us," Mendez said, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. "They're here." Elias turned to the crew, his orders sharp and precise. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Get us into high speed. If they're going to attack, we'll make them work for it." The crew moved quickly, executing their tasks with practiced efficiency. Elias remained at the helm, watching the display as the Zorvak fleet's ships appeared on the screen, their dark, jagged forms closing in fast. The Zorvak warships were intimidating, massive, menacing machines designed for destruction. They were unlike anything humanity had faced before. But Elias didn't flinch. There was a quiet resolve in his eyes. He knew the ship was no match for the Zorvak's firepower, but he wasn't going to surrender without a fight. "Initiating evasive pattern Alpha 9, Mendez called out. The ship lurched as it veered sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a barrage of missiles. The impact rattled the hull, but the shields held. For now. Elias gripped the armrests of his seat, his mind calculating their options. The ship's weapons were minimal, designed for defense rather than offense. They had the capability to disable, not destroy. But that didn't matter if they couldn't outrun the enemy. "Get me a channel to their flagship," Elias ordered, his voice steady. Mendez nodded and worked the console. After a tense moment, a chilling voice crackled through the comm system. Captain Dorsey, came the deep, resonant voice of Draxar, the Zorvak warlord. You've been warned. Abandon your ship and your mission, or we will make sure humanity remembers the consequences of crossing the Zorvak. Elias' eyes narrowed. He could hear the satisfaction in Draxar's tone. The warlord didn't just want to defeat them. He wanted to break their spirit. You won't intimidate me, Draxar, Elias said firmly. This ship is not a weapon. It's here to heal, not to fight. But if you choose to attack, we will defend ourselves. Draxar laughed, a cold, menacing sound that echoed through the comm. Heal your people, Captain. But there are no doctors in this galaxy that can save you from the Zorvak. Before Elias could respond, the transmission cut off. A moment later, the Hope's Reach shook violently as a volley of missiles exploded against its shields. The ship groaned under the pressure, its hull creaking. Elias' heart raced. They weren't prepared for this. Shields holding at 75%, Mendez reported. We can't take much more of this. Elias cursed under his breath. They needed time, but the Zorvak weren't giving them any. Their missiles continued to pummel the ship, each impact sending a jolt through the structure. The crew fought to maintain their positions, but the constant barrage was taking its toll. We need to get to the nearest asteroid field, Elias said. We can use it for cover, buy ourselves some time to regroup. Plot a course, Mendez. Without hesitation, Mendez entered the coordinates, and the ship lurched again as they changed direction. The Zorvak followed, relentless in their pursuit. Captain, Mendez called out, urgency creeping into her voice, we've lost power to the aft engines. We won't make it to the asteroid field in time. Elias clenched his jaw, his mind racing for a solution. They couldn't outrun the Zorvak, but perhaps they didn't need to. He turned to Mendez, determination in his eyes. Prepare the medical bays. We're going to need them. What do you mean? Mendez asked, her expression confused. We're not just going to run. We're going to fight. But we're going to do it on our terms. With that, Elias gave the order for the crew to prepare for the worst. The Hope's Reach was no longer just a target. It would become the battleground for a fight humanity had never wanted, but one it would be forced to face. Chapter 2. The Zorvak fleet descended upon Hope's Reach with the inevitability of a storm. Their warships were like monstrous shadows, cold and unyielding, cutting through space with terrifying precision. Each ship was a harbinger of destruction, a testament to their creator's bloodthirsty drive for dominance. Captain Elias Dorsey stood at the helm, his gaze locked on the encroaching enemy. His thoughts were a storm of urgency and determination, but outwardly, he maintained an unnerving calm. Captain, Lieutenant Mendez's voice sliced through the tension in the command deck. They're within firing range. Shields holding at 70%. Elias didn't respond immediately. His fingers hovered over the console, adjusting their trajectory as the ship veered sharply to the left, narrowly avoiding a barrage of incoming fire. The Hope's Reach was built for peace, not war. It wasn't equipped to survive a battle of this scale. But this was no ordinary enemy. The Zorvak had no interest in negotiations or mercy. Captain, we can't keep dodging forever, Mendez continued. We need to fight back or we're going to lose everything. Elias took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the ship's readouts, each pulse of red lighting up with alarming frequency. We're not equipped for battle, Mendez. Our priority is survival, not retaliation. Increase evasive maneuvers. Get us to that asteroid field. The first wave of Zorvak missiles struck the Hope's Reach with the force of a thunderclap. The ship groaned under the impact, shuddering violently. The lights flickered. A deep, metallic screech echoed from the ship's hull as if it were protesting the assault. Shields down to 50%, Captain. Mendez called out. We can't keep this up. A jolt threw Elias into his seat as the Hope's Reach was hit again. The impact sent a shockwave through the command deck, rattling everyone within. A moment of chaos ensued as alarms blared, and the crew scrambled to regain control. Medical bay. Elias shouted, panic creeping into his voice for the first time. Report on casualties. Nothing major yet, but we're losing critical systems, Dr. Naomi Shaw, the chief medical officer, responded through the comm. Prepare for mass casualties if this keeps up. Elias gritted his teeth. Understood. He turned to Mendez. How long until we reach the asteroid field? At this rate, less than 10 minutes, Mendez replied, her voice sharp with focus. But the Zorvak are closing in. We won't make it unless we disrupt their tracking systems. Elias didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do, even if it was a desperate move. Set the course. I'll handle the rest. He stood, moving quickly toward the rear of the command deck, where the ship's auxiliary control panels were located. His mind worked quickly, calculating options, weighing risks. There wasn't much time. Captain? Mendez's voice crackled in his earpiece. Concern threaded through her words. What are you thinking? Elias's fingers flew over the panel as he inputted commands, bypassing certain safety protocols in the ship's system. We're not going to outrun them, but we can make them think we've got something they want. He glanced over his shoulder, meeting Mendez's questioning gaze. We're going to trigger a false emergency distress signal, flooding our systems with power surges. Hopefully, that'll make them think we've got a weakness they can exploit. You're playing with fire, Captain. It's the only option we've got left. As the ship rattled again, another wave of missiles connected with their shields. This time, the ship groaned louder, and the lights dimmed briefly. The impact sent Elias's pulse racing, but he remained composed. He finished entering the final command and tapped a button, sending the signal out into the void. We've activated the distress signal, Elias said, returning to his seat. Now we wait. Seconds felt like hours. The Hope's Reach continued its desperate course, the asteroid field looming ever closer. The ship shuddered with every hit, but Elias remained focused on the asteroid field ahead. The space around them seemed to bend as the gravity of the rocks pulled at the ship, an invisible threat closing in. Captain, they're responding, Mendez said. Her voice was tight with disbelief. They've taken the bait. The Zorvak are altering their course to intercept the signal. A fleeting sense of relief washed over Elias, but it was short-lived. They hadn't won. This was just a temporary reprieve. Keep us on course, Elias ordered. And get me a report on the ship's status. I need to know how bad it is. Shields are at 30%, Mendez replied. Engines are functioning at minimal capacity, and we're venting oxygen from the starboard side. We're losing pressure in some of the lower decks. Elias's jaw tightened. The Hope's Reach had taken far too much damage. It wasn't just a medical vessel anymore, it was a sinking ship. But if they could reach the asteroid field, they might stand a chance. Hold on, everyone, Elias muttered to himself, gripping the edge of his console. His eyes flicked to the view screen as the asteroid field began to fill the display. Jagged rocks floated in an eerie, chaotic formation, a natural labyrinth of dangerous terrain. We're almost there, Mendez said, her voice barely audible under the tension. Once we're inside, we can use the field as cover. If we can maneuver through the rocks, we might just escape. Another impact shook the Hope's Reach, and the ship lurched violently. Several crew members were thrown from their seats, and a loud crash echoed through the command deck. Report, Elias shouted. We've lost the forward stabilizers, Mendez said through gritted teeth. We're drifting. The ship was no longer in control of its trajectory. The asteroid field was closing in fast, and the Zorvak had not given up their pursuit. Elias knew they had to get inside the field now, before the Zorvak could adjust their course. Initiating evasive maneuvers now, Elias ordered, tapping the controls with urgency. He watched as the asteroid field loomed ever closer, the massive rocks appearing larger with each passing second. We're in, Mendez shouted. Hold on tight. The Hope's Reach plunged into the asteroid field, narrowly avoiding several massive boulders that tore through the space around them. The ship bounced off the smaller rocks, but the shields held, barely. The Zorvak ships followed, relentless in their pursuit. The Hope's Reach veered sharply, diving between the asteroid clusters, twisting and turning with all the maneuverability it had left. Elias's eyes darted between the display and the view screen, calculating each move, each inch of space. "We're not going to outrun them forever," Mendez said, her voice tight with stress. "We need a plan." Elias's mind raced, but one thing was certain. Their time was running out. "Keep us moving," he said. "We'll buy some time and hope the distress signal buys us enough of a chance to make a run for it." But deep down, Elias knew there was only one way out. He had to find a way to strike back. But for now, all he could do was survive. The Hope's Reach was a medical ship, not a weapon. But that didn't mean it couldn't become one if it had to. Chapter 3. The ship shuddered violently, another tremor of destruction slamming into the hull of Hope's Reach. Captain Elias Dorsey gripped the control panel with white knuckles, his heart pounding as he watched the asteroid field growing smaller in the rear view. They had made it inside, but it wasn't enough. The Zorvak ships were relentless. They weren't just chasing them. They were trying to annihilate them. "Shields at 15%, Captain." Lieutenant Mendez's voice crackled from the comms, strained and tense. "We're barely holding together. We won't last much longer in here." The air in the command deck felt thick, suffocating. Elias' eyes darted between the monitors, warning lights flashing red, alerts popping up like an unrelenting storm. The Hope's Reach was barely intact. The once pristine medical vessel, designed to save lives, was now nothing more than a fragile shell trying to survive in a war it was never meant to fight. "We can't outrun them much longer," Mendez continued, her voice now cold and calculating. "The asteroid field isn't big enough to shake them. We'll have to make a stand." Elias took a deep breath, exhaling slowly as the reality of their situation settled over him. They were trapped. The Zorvak were closing in, their advanced warships effortlessly navigating the treacherous terrain of the asteroid field. The Hope's Reach was ill-equipped for combat. Its defenses were minimal, designed to protect patients and medical supplies, not to engage in intergalactic warfare. "Plot a course to the nearest moon," Elias ordered, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. "We need to get out of this field, regroup, and figure out our next move." Mendez's hands flew over the controls, and the ship lurched forward. The asteroid field was behind them now, but their escape wasn't going unnoticed. The Zorvak had followed them into the space beyond, their ships now looming like predators in the dark. "Captain, I'm detecting a massive Zorvak cruiser in pursuit," the comms officer, Lieutenant Riley, said, his voice shaking with urgency. "They're catching up." Elias clenched his jaw. They weren't going to make it to the moon at this rate. The Zorvak cruiser was far too fast, and the Hope's Reach had no chance of outrunning it. But there was no choice now. They had to make the moon their refuge or die trying. "Increase speed," Elias commanded, but deep down, he knew it was a futile attempt. "Bring us down to the surface. The moon's gravity might give us a chance to lose them." The rocky moon loomed ahead, barren and desolate. It wasn't much, but it was their only hope. The Zorvak cruiser sensors would struggle to pick up on the Hope's Reach among the rough, uneven landscape of the moon's surface. That was their only chance, a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. As the ship plunged through the atmosphere, the console lit up with alarms. A sharp hiss of pressure escaping from the hull filled the cabin. A wave of cold sweat dripped down Elias' neck as he gripped the controls, trying to keep the ship from breaking apart. "Brace for impact," Elias barked, gripping the armrests of his seat. "Mendez, we need to land this ship now." The Hope's Reach bucked violently as it entered the moon's atmosphere, the friction of the descent causing the ship to rattle. The exterior groaned, the hull protesting the violent entry. For a moment, Elias thought they were going to crash, but Mendez's expert piloting steadied the ship just in time. The Hope's Reach hit the surface with a bone-jarring thud, skidding across the rocky terrain before finally coming to a halt. The command deck was silent for a beat. Elias could hear the hum of the ship's engines slowly dying down, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. "We're down," Mendez said, her voice quiet, barely above a whisper. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. They had survived the landing. But that didn't mean they were safe. Report, he barked, shaking himself out of the stupor of relief. How's the ship? Mendes looked at the readout, her brow furrowed. We've got extensive damage to the aft engines. Life support is still functioning, but the structural integrity of the ship is compromised. The landing wasn't pretty, but it could have been worse. Casualties? Elias asked, though he dreaded the answer. None, Mendes replied, her eyes meeting his. But there are critical systems down. The medical bay is going to need repairs before we can transport the wounded. We can't afford any more hits. Elias nodded grimly. The crew had been lucky, but they couldn't count on luck much longer. The Zorvak would be here soon. They needed to prepare for the inevitable attack. We don't have much time, Elias said, already moving toward the door. Get everyone to the defensive positions. I'll meet you in the control room. Mendes followed close behind, her pace quickening. What's the plan, Captain? Elias turned to her as they moved down the corridor. We're going to make the Hope's Reach look like a sitting target. We'll use our limited firepower to lure them in, then hit them hard with everything we've got. It's all or nothing now. Mendes's eyes narrowed. It's a suicide mission. I'm not suggesting we charge them head-on, Elias replied, his voice tight with resolve. We'll use the moon's surface to our advantage. We'll make them think they have us cornered. And when they do, we hit them from every angle. The command center was chaos as the crew scrambled to prepare for battle. Elias's mind raced with calculations, but it wasn't the math that bothered him. It was the realization that they were about to take a gamble that could cost them everything. He wasn't naive. He knew what this meant. There was no way out unless they made their stand here, on this barren moon, with the Zorvak closing in. Dr. Naomi Shaw appeared at his side, her face drawn with exhaustion but determination in her eyes. Captain, I've got patients who need immediate care. If we're going to fight, we need to know how long we have. Elias turned to her, his gaze softening. I know, Naomi, but we have no choice. We fight or we die. Her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't like it, but she nodded. Understood. The crew rallied together, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on their shoulders. Everyone knew the odds. Everyone knew that this might be their last stand. But there was something about this ship, the Hope's Reach, that made them all believe in one thing. They weren't going down without a fight. As the Zorvak cruisers descended from the sky, their dark silhouettes cutting through the cold light of the moon's surface, Elias stood at the helm, watching them approach. He could hear the pulse of his own heart, steady and resolute. This is it, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Let's show them what humanity's really made of. Chapter 4. The barren moon stretched out before Captain Elias Dorsey, its dusty surface cracked and scarred, just like the Hope's Reach itself. The ship's systems were limping along, its hull bruised, its medical bays out of order, and the crew in varying stages of exhaustion and desperation. Yet they were alive. And they would fight. The Zorvak fleet, now in full pursuit, had closed the distance. They were relentless. Their heavy cruisers were now positioned above the moon, ready to begin the final phase of their mission, destroying the Hope's Reach and annihilating any hope humanity had of maintaining their ideals. Elias stood before the ship's central command interface, his hands resting on the console as he observed the enemy ships on the display. The gravity of the situation pressed against his chest. The plan was in motion now, but it was fragile. There was no room for error. Every calculation, every second of hesitation, could cost them their lives. They're in position. Mendes's voice broke through the quiet tension in the command deck. Her tone was calm but laced with an urgency that echoed through the room. We won't be able to hold them off for long. The Zorvak will come down in waves, and their cruisers are equipped with advanced weaponry. We need to act fast. Elias nodded, his jaw clenched tightly. We've got one shot at this. Once they land, we're stuck in a defensive position. We'll use the terrain. The moon's surface will act as our cover, but we need to get the first strike in. The crew worked in silence, their faces etched with weariness, but there was a shared understanding among them all. This was it. The last stand. There would be no more running, no more hiding. They would fight until the very last moment. Captain, Dr. Naomi Shaw's voice came over the comms, her concern evident despite her professional tone. The medical bays are barely functional. I've got injured crew members I can't treat properly under these conditions. I know, Elias replied, his voice tight with both frustration and sympathy. But right now, we don't have a choice. Get the critical cases to the auxiliary medical pods. We'll make do. I need you ready for what's coming. The ship's alarms blared again, signaling the imminent Zorvak landing. Elias could feel the weight of responsibility like an anchor, dragging him down. They had already lost so much. The ship, the peace they had once stood for, and now, their ideals were about to be tested in a way that felt like a betrayal. Elias stood for a moment longer, gazing out at the moon's surface. The barren landscape offered no comfort, no solace. He thought of humanity's mission, to spread healing and unity, to be a force for good in a fractured galaxy. But here they were, fighting for survival, for the very right to exist as they had always been. The Zorvak didn't understand that. To them, peace was a weakness. They didn't see the value in compassion, only in domination. And in this moment, Elias was starting to wonder if they had ever been right to believe in a different way. Captain, Mendez's voice interrupted his thoughts. We've lost communication with the auxiliary systems. The Zorvak are jamming our signals. Stay focused, Elias said sharply. He could hear the fear in her voice. If we don't make this count, it's over. We're not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing us crumble. The rumble of enemy engines reverberated through the deck. Elias knew that the Zorvak were close. He could almost feel the ground beneath the ship tremble as their heavy ships descended toward the surface. Ready to initiate the attack, Captain, Mendez reported, her voice steady but laced with the tension of knowing what they were about to do. We've set the targeting systems to fire on their landing zones as soon as they break atmosphere. Do it, Elias commanded. Once they land, we'll be surrounded. We don't have a lot of time. Fire when you're ready. The seconds felt like an eternity as they all held their breath. Finally, Mendez's fingers hit the button, and the Hope's Reach unleashed a barrage of artillery designed to disrupt the Zorvak's landing craft. The missiles streaked across the sky, hitting their targets with pinpoint accuracy. The first Zorvak ships trembled under the blast, their shields flaring in protest. But the larger cruisers, the ones that truly posed a threat, remained unscathed. Direct hit on their landing ships, Mendez reported. But the cruisers are still coming down. No stopping them. The Zorvak, having lost some ground, retaliated with all their fury. A burst of plasma fire from the lead cruiser tore through the atmosphere, striking the surface of the moon with a devastating explosion. The force of the blast rattled the ship, and Elias stumbled forward, his hands bracing against the console to keep his balance. Shields are down to 10%, Mendez called out, a thread of panic creeping into her voice. We need to get the last defensive system online now or we're finished. We're going to give them hell before we go down, Elias said through clenched teeth, the fire of resolve igniting in his chest. Activate the remaining turrets. We'll hold them off as long as we can. The battle had begun in earnest. The Zorvak landed in waves, their heavily armed soldiers pouring from their ships and charging across the rocky surface toward the ship's position. Elias's heart thundered as he watched the first group of soldiers breach the perimeter. We got company, Mendez said, voice sharp. Prepare for engagement. Elias's fingers moved with practiced precision over the control panel, activating the ship's remaining defensive systems. The remaining turrets on the surface sprang to life, firing with deadly accuracy, mowing down the first wave of advancing Zorvak soldiers. But for every soldier that fell, 2 more took their place. The Zorvak didn't retreat. They didn't falter. They kept coming. Hold the line, Elias shouted over the comms, his voice a mix of command and desperation. Keep firing. We're not backing down. Elias stood by the window of the command deck, watching the chaos unfold outside. The crew fought bravely, but Elias could feel the exhaustion setting in. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that they were up against something far larger than they could defeat with weapons alone. The Zorvak were not just invaders. They were a symbol of the galaxy's brokenness, a reminder of what humanity was up against. But Elias knew, deep down, that the fight wasn't about weapons, it was about the choices they made in these moments. And even now, in the face of overwhelming odds, they had a choice. They could choose to fight, to prove that humanity's ideals of compassion, of healing, of hope, meant something. In that instant, Elias realized something. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about showing the galaxy that no matter how dark the universe got, humanity would never stop fighting for the light. The ship shook again, but this time, Elias didn't flinch. They had been tested, and they would keep standing. "Captain," Mendez said, her voice steady again, "we've got a breach in the East Wing. They're pushing us back." Elias turned toward her, his eyes cold with resolve. "Let them come. We're not backing down." And with that, they continued to fight. There was no more talk of retreat. This was their last stand, and they would hold it with every last ounce of strength they had. Chapter 5. The battle raged on, its intensity growing with every passing minute. The Hope's Reach was little more than a shattered fortress, its shields failing, its systems barely holding together. The Zorvak forces had landed in full force, their soldiers flooding the barren moon's surface like an unstoppable tide. Elias Dorsey stood at the helm, his hands gripping the command console, his mind racing through plans and contingencies. But there was no time for planning anymore. There was only the fight. "Captain, the Zorvak are pushing in from the west side," Lieutenant Mendez reported, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. "We've lost control of the perimeter defenses. If they breach the inner chambers, we're done." Elias looked at the tactical readout, where the enemy icons advanced steadily toward their position. His eyes narrowed, but there was no panic in them. He had long since accepted that survival was no longer an option. They would fight until the very last moment. They would die with their ideals intact, with humanity's honor still shining through the smoke and fire. "Elias," Naomi Shaw's voice came over the comms, softer than usual. "We're evacuating the medical bay. The injured can't survive another assault if we don't get them to safety." He paused, his hand hovering over the control panel. He could hear the cries of the injured, the crackling of fire, and the distant sound of weapons fire. His crew, his family, was fighting a war they had never wanted. "Take them to the auxiliary pods," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "Tell them to stay there, Naomi. We'll hold the line for as long as we can." As he spoke, the ship's alarm sounded again. This time, the shrill warning of an incoming breach from the east. The Zorvak had managed to break through their final defense line. They were inside the ship. "Brace yourselves," Elias barked, turning to Mendez. "This is it. We'll make our stand at the core. Get everyone there now. We fight together or not at all." Mendez nodded and immediately sent out the command to assemble the remaining crew. There were only a handful left, their numbers dwindling as the Zorvak pushed forward. The medical team had done their best, but now their efforts were futile. The crew had one job left: to fight. Elias moved toward the aft deck, his mind focused on the singular goal ahead: hold the core. The Zorvak would not take the ship without a fight. And if they had to die here, they would make sure the enemy understood one thing: humanity was not weak, and humanity would never bow down to tyranny. The crew gathered in the command room, their faces grim but determined. Mendez, Riley, Shaw, and a few other survivors took their positions, readying weapons and preparing the last of the defensive systems. "They're coming," Mendez said, her eyes scanning the monitors. "They've breached the lower levels. We don't have long." Elias nodded. "We need to get their attention. We can't let them reach the heart of the ship." There was no time to waste. They had no backup, no reinforcements, only their will to survive and the weapons at their disposal. Elias turned to Shaw, who was preparing a makeshift medical station in the back of the room. "Naomi, stay with the injured. If we don't make it, you're the only one who can get them to safety." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with an unspoken understanding. She had always known the risks, But there was a finality to this moment that no one had prepared for. "I will," she said softly, her voice steady. "You're not alone, Elias. We're all in this together." Elias forced a tight smile, though the weight of the situation bore down on him. The Zorvak were closing in. The core room would be their last stand. With a nod, he turned to Mendez and Riley. "Prepare the ship's core for lockdown. We can't afford to lose control of this ship." "Understood, Captain," Mendez replied, already moving to secure the access points. The sounds of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed through the ship's corridors. The Zorvak were relentless, and they were almost at the core. Elias could hear the pounding of boots, the shouts of the enemy soldiers, and the faint hum of their weaponry charging. "They're almost here," Riley reported, his voice tight with stress. "Get to your positions," Elias barked. "Hold nothing back. This ends here." The Zorvak soldiers appeared at the door to the command room, their massive forms silhouetted in the dim light of the corridor. They were merciless, their weapons raised, their eyes cold with the certainty of victory. Elias felt a rush of adrenaline as he looked at the men and women around him, his crew, his comrades. In that moment, there was no fear, only resolve. "On my mark," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "Fire." The sound of gunfire erupted in the small room as the crew unleashed everything they had. The Zorvak soldiers were met with a barrage of plasma shots, but the Zorvak were relentless. They didn't flinch. They didn't retreat. They came forward, returning fire with brutal precision. Elias ducked behind a pillar, his heart hammering in his chest. The crew fought fiercely, their weapons flashing in the darkness, their faces set in grim determination. But the Zorvak were too numerous. Slowly, steadily, they pushed their way into the command room, forcing the crew back, step by step. The battle was fierce, but there was no question in Elias's mind. They had given everything. They had fought with everything they had, and now it was time for the final sacrifice. "We're not going to make it," Mendez said, her voice strained. "They're pushing us back." Elias's eyes met hers. There was no time for words now. He knew. They all knew. This was the end. But as the last Zorvak soldier advanced, a strange calm washed over him. He wasn't afraid. They had fought to the last breath, and that was enough. "We've held them off," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "We've shown them what humanity is made of." A single Zorvak soldier stepped forward, his weapon aimed at Elias. But before he could fire, Mendez, with her final ounce of strength, launched herself at the soldier, knocking him off balance. The rest of the crew followed suit, a final burst of defiance in the face of certain death. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as the ship shuddered again, this time violently. He heard the faint crackling of systems going down, the sound of oxygen being vented from the ship. The final battle had come to an end. The Hope's Reach was going to be lost. But they had made sure of one thing: the Zorvak would never forget the humans who fought for peace, no matter the cost. As the last of the Zorvak soldiers fell, Elias closed his eyes. The ship was lost, but the message had been clear. Humanity had fought, not for survival, but for something far greater. The Hope's Reach would never return to the stars. But its legacy, the legacy of those who had stood and fought, would live on forever. And in that final moment, Elias understood. The battle for humanity's ideals was not over. It would continue, long after the dust settled on this forgotten moon.